Having conducted a pay survey, we have some very important data available to us. We have a market pay line, and if we've decided to make a deliberate choice about how we are going to address that market pay line, we will also have a pay policy line. So that's a very important insight in terms of the way in which we understand the world around our organisation, the things that influence the expectations of employees, our understanding of how our competitors are attempting to address the similar labour markets that we are attempting to address. So that market orientation is very important. But it's only a first step because, as we already know, there are important internal comparisons that we have to be aware of as well. And we know that for employees, those internal comparisons are often much more important, much more powerful in terms of their potential dissatisfaction or demotivation than that external comparison might be in most cases, although in some cases the external comparison will be very, very powerful as well. But whatever the specifics of a situation, we have these two different sets of comparisons to deal with. Our understanding of what we're dealing with in the world outside of our organisation, in the marketplace, and what we're dealing with within our organisation, within our workforce, where employees work side by side with each other and make judgments about each other. So part of the process, part of the challenge of building an effective pay structure is about how we use those two sets of information, how we bring together the internal and external comparisons in order to influence the design of our pay structure. Now, the simplest approach to doing this would be to simply use our pay policy line as the pricing mechanism for our workforce. Having undertaken a job evaluation process, we have some idea, and we may have greater or lesser faith in that justification, but we have a justification about where all of the jobs within our workforce sit alongside of each other, which ones are at the bottom, which ones are at the top, and where every other job sits alongside of that. We have our hierarchy. Now, given that we have that hierarchy on one axis, and we have a pay policy line, which tells us where similar jobs are being paid in the marketplace, then it will be quite straightforward to simply plot each one of the jobs within our job structure and run a straight line up to the pay policy line and then across to the other axis, the pay axis, so that we could get a market referenced pay rate for every job within the organisation. And this basic market level of pay is quite attractive in that way. We don't have to think anymore. We've done our internal comparison. Presumably most people are more or less happy with that by now. We've designed it well, points rated system, analytical scheme. We know where everybody sits, and we've done a good pay survey so we get market pay for everyone. Good enough? Well, the problems with that kind of approach are twofold. The first thing is that what we would be constructing would be a separate rate of pay for every job within the organisation. Now, in a relatively small organisation, that might be okay. That might not be much of a problem. But as an organisation scales, then you start to run into problems of management. How do you resource a pay system which might potentially have dozens, scores even, of different individual rates of pay? So complexity is a problem. And as the organisation gets bigger, we're looking for potential to simplify, to reduce the differences in rates of pay between jobs. And as organisations get very big, those pressures only increase. The second issue is that we are also only constructing a spot rate pay scheme. Now, spot rate pay schemes were very common in quite traditional organizations. If you go into traditional manufacturing industries and you look at the pay rates for the traditional crafts or trades, the engineers, the electricians, plumbers, those kind of skilled trades, you'll often see this kind of scheme. But they're much less common nowadays. And the reason for that is because organizations will often want to distinguish between people who are doing the same job. Now, that might be for entirely legitimate reasons, because you may have somebody who's doing a job who has been doing it for 20 years and they know that job inside out and they are extremely skilled at that job. And the question is whether you want to have the same level of reward for someone like that as you would have for somebody who was just coming in as an 18-year-old on their first day in the job. And whether or not that kind of spot rate structure would provide the kind of advantages for retention, commitment, loyalty, and even just the recognition of somebody's longevity within a particular role. We also want to distinguish between people who are doing the same job on grounds of performance, that somebody is really good at it and they're better at it than somebody else. And so just having this single rate of pay, a spot rate scheme for every job within your pay structure doesn't provide you with that degree of flexibility. So you're looking to simplify the structure so you don't have to deal with potentially dozens of scores of different rates of pay. And you also want to establish not a point on a pay scale for a job, but maybe a range of points on that pay scale which relate to a job or a group of jobs. So we're trying to aggregate some of the differences within the pay structure that are implied by simply reading off the job evaluation score off the pay policy line. We want to reduce the complexity that implies. Now, what this means is that rather than treating every job separately in relation to the pay structure, what we need to do is to start to group jobs together. So we go back to our job evaluation scores and we start to look for patterns. Are there types of jobs that have similar overall scores, that they're within a range of job evaluation points? Are there clusters within the spread of job evaluation scores which indicate that there's something that those jobs have in common, that there is similar size, a similar weight within the job structure? Are there any natural gaps that occur between one group of jobs within the job structure and the next job, which might indicate that there's a gap, that there's this level of importance in the job structure, and then there's another level of pay structure? Natural gaps, natural patterns within the structures that we're putting in place. Now, these are just the beginning, the starting point of how we might start to group together jobs for the purpose of building a pay structure. They're not the be-all and end-all. Sometimes organizations will use kind of computer-assisted approaches to identify some of these gaps. But really what we're interested in is establishing a credible and coherent pay structure that makes sense for the people who do the jobs within it. So it's important that we don't just rely on there's a cluster of jobs and there's the next cluster of jobs, so there is the boundary between them, but rather that we start to think about, well, when we have this cluster of jobs and then a gap, that gap probably represents a promotion opportunity for the lower, the less senior jobs. If we were to think about the position of a job in that lower group, does the move up to the next level of pay represent a logical promotion? Would that person's immediate superior within the structure be found within that next group? Are they in the right place? Is the boundary between the lower and the higher jobs, is that appropriate to someone's potential career path through an organisation? Is it motivating people? Is it sending the right kind of message? So we look for natural patterns, natural breaks, but then we, more importantly, need to have a common sense approach, or a more contextualized approach, to say where we place a boundary between one group of jobs and the next, a boundary in the pay structure, does that actually make sense? So we start to put these grade boundaries in place across the job structure, and effectively what we're doing is breaking up all of the hierarchy of jobs within the organisation into groups. And so we stop thinking about individual jobs and what those individual jobs are worth relative to the pay policy line, but rather to think about what those groups of jobs, or grades of jobs as we call them, what those grades are worth relevant to the pay policy line. So we're simplifying. We're going from potentially dozens or scores of jobs into a handful of grades, groups of jobs grouped together, and that every job within a single grade will be treated the same way in relation to the pay structure. Now, how we put that in place is to go back to thinking about a grade of jobs, and we say, where is the middle point of that grade? And where does that midpoint of the grade intersect with the pay policy line? And that will be the midpoint of your range of pay for all of the jobs within that grade. Now then, what we have to decide is, what should the range of pay be for all of those jobs within that grade? How much above the pay policy line might someone be able to go? What would the maximum rate of pay be for a job like that? And how much below the pay policy line might the rate of pay be for the jobs within that grade? So what would the minimum and maximum rate of pay be for a job within that grade? What is the overall pay range? So we've simplified the job structure into a graded structure. We've reduced the complexity that way, but then we've introduced flexibility by, rather than simply having a single point of pay for the market referenced rate for the jobs within that grade, but we've expanded our flexibility to say it might be anywhere that we pay a job within this grade, anywhere between the minimum rate and the maximum rate. And we can make decisions about how people move from the minimum to the maximum based on performance, or based on length of service, or whatever it might be. But we provided, we provided ourselves with two advantages from the initial approach that I mentioned. We reduced complexity and added flexibility into that. Now, obviously we've got all kinds of design choices about how we put a pay structure like this together. The first one I've already mentioned, the choices about where the grade boundaries go, but there are also choices about how many grade boundaries we want to have, how big are the groupings of jobs that we want to put together. Do we want to have relatively narrow grades, or do we want to have broader grades that include a bigger range of groups? And we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of this clip. But the other design choice is about the relationship of the ranges of pay between one grade and the next. So just how does that pattern of setting minimum and maximum for each grade of each range, how does that look when it's compared to the choices that are made for the next grade in the structure? Now, this is important because it indicates what we call the degree of overlap in pay between one part of the pay structure and the next. So if you're in a grade at a lower level in the pay structure, and you look at the next level up in the pay structure, depending on the design choices that have been made, there will be more or less commonality between the rates of pay that you might get in your grade and that they might be received in the next grade up. Now that's important in terms of how that affects your behaviour at work, because the more commonality, the more overlap that there is between your grade and the next one, the less friction, the lower the barriers might be for you to cooperate with people who occupy jobs within that next grade in the pay structure. So if there's a very small overlap, less commonality, greater barriers to cooperation. Big overlap, more commonality, smaller barriers to cooperation. So this, if you remember the discussions that we've talked about previously, when we talk about choices between a hierarchical approach and an egalitarian approach, this is what it looks like when it's put into practice. A big overlap means a flatter structure. It means that there are less differences as we move up the pay structure. The jump from one point in the pay structure to the next is smaller. So we're encouraging teamwork, cooperation. If our pay structure is steeper, big jumps between one point in the structure and the next, with smaller overlaps, then we're encouraging very different types of behaviour. We're saying to people that if you apply for a promotion, if you stand out, if you excel, if you're brilliant, then that will be really valuable to you. The increase in pay will be enormous. And so therefore, we're encouraging those individual types of behaviour. We're placing much less emphasis on cooperation, on the potential for teamwork across grades within the structure. Final thing that I want to talk about in terms of design decision is to go back to that choice regarding the size of the grades. Basically, how many grade boundaries do we put in? How many divisions do we place? Now, there's been a broad movement in the design of reward systems over the last 20 years or so, which has been to move away from narrow grades towards broader grades, or as they call them, broader bands. Now, this is achieved by effectively collapsing a number of narrow grades into a big, broad band. Now, the advantage of this from an employer's point of view is to remove those barriers to cooperation, because everybody is ostensibly within the same part of the pay structure, and so the potential for cooperation is increased. Now, the problem that might arise from that is that by collapsing all of those grades together, the overall pay range that applies to that broad band becomes huge, because you go from the minimum of the lowest former narrow grade up to the maximum of the most senior narrow grade within a single broad band. So you could have a very, very large pay range that could potentially apply to a group of jobs within a broad band, which is potentially troublesome from an employer's control of labour costs. So in order to generate the advantages of increased cooperation through a broad-banded structure and to minimise the disadvantages of enormous potential labour costs, one of the things that we often see organisations putting in place with this is so-called shadow pay ranges or pay zones, whereby individual job families, who might previously have been in separate narrow grades, within a single broad band have very different rates of pay that are market referenced to their particular job family. Now, some might call that having your cake and eating it, but others might call it simply good reward design.